I want to start out by saying that I believe there's no such thing as advice. There are only other people's stories. So if I go and generalize in this talk and I sound like I'm expounding some universal law, well, you decide for yourself whether our stories align and take from this only what you find useful. I also like to think that everything happens for a reason that you can make up afterwards. And those reasons we make up afterwards matter, because if we didn't make up stories like this for ourselves, our lives would seem unbearably random. So at first, what I really wanted to do today was to tell a story about something that I did, some set of decisions that I made that led to some beautiful book or exciting project, because we do a lot of that at Electric Bookworks, where my team and I make books and websites, and at Book Dash, the children's book nonprofit I help to lead. But this month's theme is transit. And the more I thought about transit, the more I realized that there is another story in all our lives, which is the story of what happens between the doing of things, when we're no longer doing A and not yet doing B. So I thought back and asked myself, what happened when I wasn't moving forward? When I was in the empty spaces, the passive spaces. And I thought it's kind of what Dr. Seuss calls the waiting place. 1 minute we're trotting along, full of beans, in control, and the next minute we grind to a halt, often for reasons beyond our control, and we find ourselves in the waiting place. And I suspect that many of us are feeling stuck this year. I know I am in at least one area. The healthcare nonprofit that I help lead, called Better Care, has been flattened by the pandemic. We recently could no longer employ a wonderful colleague. We've had to shutter most of our services. So we're no longer where we were, and we're not yet where we want to be, and we're stuck in the waiting place. And when any of us get stuck, we take a seat on a kind of cosmic public transit and wait. It's as if we're on a bus or a plane sitting still, but whether we like it or not, we're being moved from where we were to where we will be, and we don't know where we'll end up. And there's a big difference between being on a trip we've chosen and finding ourselves stuck on one that's chosen for us. But that's the way the world works. Whether we like it or not, either we're doing the moving or we're stuck and the world is moving us. Life doesn't stop. It just starts making our decisions for us. Because in the swirling universe, there's no such thing as being stationary. And I have a funny personal story about public transit. It's become a personal metaphor for me. A few years ago, I was traveling to a kind of retreat near Merida in rural Mexico. And I had to fly via Mexico City Airport. So Mexico City Airport had a lot of flights, but not as many gates. So several flights might board from one gate at the same time. And this was pretty unnerving, but everyone else seemed totally fine with it. So I muddle my way to the plane and I find my seat and I sit there for a long time until another passenger clambers in and he tells me that I'm in his seat. I'm a little taken aback. So I take out my boarding pass and I show it to him and he looks at it and then his eyes widen and he tells me quietly that I am on the wrong plane. And somehow, no one who checked my boarding pass had noticed. So after some general panic and confusion, the ground staff rocket me across the tarmac in a small bakkie to the right plane, this plane in the picture, which thankfully was still waiting despite my strange disappearance. And I often wonder what would have happened if I'd landed somewhere entirely unfamiliar on the other side of Mexico, not knowing where on earth I was. And now, of course, every time I'm on a plane, I know that I might really be on the wrong one. And I hate that. Right? That feeling of being there, not being sure, is what the waiting place is like. You're not making decisions and you could land up anywhere. And so when life sticks us in the waiting place, it can be really hard, but it's going to happen and it's going to keep happening. So, how should I make sense of these sudden stops? And if I can make sense of them, if I can make up some reason for them, maybe they won't feel so unfair and disempowering and I'll weather them better. Okay, so there have been a couple of ways I've landed in the waiting place. And maybe you'll recognize something like this in your own story. Sometimes the world just bursts my bubble. It's like an earthquake or a pandemic or just bad luck. And I don't have the resources to weather the storm, and there's nothing I can do. And at other times, I push so hard that something breaks. Maybe I push myself till I get sick, or I overspend on a project. I don't manage my resources, and that's totally on me. And in both cases, I want to understand what happened, and I want to know what to do with myself while I'm stuck in a waiting place. Back in 2014, my startup Paperwhite was crashing. I'd been through the crash of a startup before, 4 years earlier, but this was much worse. At Paperwhite, we had this big, bold vision. We wanted every book within walking distance of every home. And what we did towards that was to make it possible and legal for photocopy shops to print books out for you on demand. So you walk into any photocopy shop, ask for a book, and they could print it out for you while you wait. And the copy shop pays a small license fee, and you pay for that in the printing. And anyone with a printer copier could be a reseller like this. And working this way, we could slash the cost of books by up to 40%. And because we cut out so much of the supply chain, like warehousing and delivery, publishers still earn the same amount of money per copy as they did from their regular editions. And we had over 400 registered copy shops and over 2,000 books in our catalog. We were winning innovation prizes around the world. We were congratulated in Parliament. I was on TV and on the covers of magazines. We were being generously funded by the Shuttleworth Foundation. But all this time, we couldn't sign the one kind of book we most needed for everything to come together, and that was university textbooks. Those books were the sweet spot. There was a huge demand for them, and they carried a substantial license fee that would have made us sustainable. But higher ed publishers just would not sign with us. They could not bring themselves to treat copy shops as legitimate booksellers rather than sites of piracy. And after 5 years of trying, I eventually had to admit defeat. And that was a crushing blow to my confidence. And I was really bitter. I'd really thought we had a way to put every book within walking distance of every home and to spark the kind of reading culture that every publisher dreams for. Every publisher dreams of publishing into a reading culture. And I could not believe that so many people had brushed that off as wishful thinking. Anyway, I knew that Paperwhite was on the ropes, but we hadn't made that public yet, so I felt really stuck. Paperwhite's future was out of my control. And the thing about being a solo founder when everything's coming apart is that you feel very, very alone. And I think sometimes that something in that loneliness made me wonder, in a kind of petulant, I'll show you all way, if we really needed to work with all these publishers to make a real difference. What could we do without them? Did we really need their help to get more books to people? If we couldn't distribute other publishers' books, what if we just made our own books? And I remember going on these really, really long runs because I felt that that was the one place I could think creatively. And on one of them, by the time I got home, I knew that even if Paperwhite was going to die, at least I was going to make children's books and give them away. And I thrashed out the idea with my colleague Taryn and my wife Michelle, and we called it Book Dash. And 2 months later, we held our first bookmaking event where we created 2 new children's books in one day. By the end of that year, we'd done it again and published 20 books and crowdfunded thousands of free copies to give to children. And back then, I could not have imagined that today, 6 years later, we would have published 146 books, and that next month, a child will get our 1 millionth free book delivered in a Santa's shoebox for Christmas. It's 1 million books. Still, all of that was yet to come. Right then, I still had a problem. I had no way to pay salaries. I still had a dying company in my hands. And I spent the next 12 months grasping at straws and steadily letting the team go until eventually I shut everything down. And to pay my own bills, I went back to the thing that had got me through the last time a business failed, doing freelance book layout from home and trying to sell healthcare books with Better Care, a little business I'd started before Paperwhite. But man, I was finished. The Paperwhite experience had wiped out my confidence. I had genuinely lost the ability to make decisions or to feel sure about anything. And while outwardly I kept up a brave face, inwardly I was giving up. And to feel better about myself, I put more and more of my creative energy into our side project Book Dash and some experimental software I was writing for making books. And emotionally, these side projects were keeping me sane. By late 2015, I was running on empty. I'd spent 18 months in the waiting place, unable to make decisions with any confidence, and clueless about how I was going to piece a career together. I was sending out job applications and not even getting replies. And then in late 2015, I got on that flight to Mexico. The Shuttleworth Foundation, who'd funded Paperwhite, was gathering its fellows from around the world in a hacienda in the rural Yucatan. But at that time, I was feeling very rubbish. I had a bad hay fever and a bad cold. My ears were all blocked and my skin was all broken out from stress. And the last thing I wanted to do was travel for 40 hours to be with a group of upbeat entrepreneurs. But Michelle persuaded me, saying it would be a good break. And maybe she wanted a little break from her miserable husband too. So I made the trip, just popping Disprins all the way. And as I mentioned earlier, that trip did not start well, or rather it could have started in entirely the wrong part of Mexico, and who knows where I'd be now. The Disprins thinned my blood so badly that one evening I had to leave dinner because a mosquito bite I scratched literally bled all over my shirt. Sorry. My ears got so blocked that I went totally deaf on one side. So I'm hardly listening to the conversations. And every day, everyone was talking about their amazing projects. And I just felt so awful that mine had crashed so spectacularly. And even though I was trying so hard to pretend I was fine, eventually I couldn't do it anymore. And by the last day, I was in tears in front of everyone, admitting how shitty I felt about taking 3 years of their funding and support and having nothing to show for it. But no one minded. They were so kind. And that, I think, with hindsight, was a turning point. Imperceptibly small, but a turning point nonetheless. Some kind of weight lifted. And somehow that moment marked the end of an 18-month stint in the waiting place. And a few months later, that experimental software I'd been working on had become the foundation of what is now Electric Bookworks. So what do I tell myself about the waiting place now? Well, the way I think about it is this. When I'm in the waiting place, I am rebalancing my debts and I'm reinvesting in myself. And to explain what I mean by that, I need to take a step back. To grow anything, we have to borrow from somewhere. We get nowhere meaningful in life or build anything significant if we don't invest something extra. And where do we get our resources to invest? We borrow. We get into debt to others and to parts of ourselves. And I don't just mean money debt. Just like we might borrow money to buy better tools, we borrow energy from friends for support. We borrow from our bodies by not exercising or not sleeping enough or eating badly. We borrow ideas. We borrow from our education to support our families, and we borrow from our families for our education. We are all always managing debt in many forms. And very importantly, this kind of debt is not a bad thing. Debt is inevitable and necessary. It is the lever by which we lift ourselves and others. And it's closely related to what economists call opportunity costs, how by doing A, we give up the opportunity to do B. Like the opportunity cost of a night out is a cozy evening at home, and the opportunity cost of a business trip is time with our children. And the world collects on those debts eventually. One way or another, we'll pay them in money or in kind or in loneliness or shame, or if we're lucky, in the joy we bring to others with what we create, or in a number of ways. Climate change even is a kind of grand global debt collection. And to create, we have to be allowed to borrow. Paperwhite fell short because I couldn't borrow enough. Higher education publishers wouldn't lend me their IP. And that, frustratingly enough, was their prerogative. They didn't have to lend me the credence that others had done. It doesn't matter whether they think I missed an opportunity. And then when Paperwhite crashed, I was embarrassed and disappointed in myself. I'd been on the covers of magazines. I'd given TEDx talks. I had made a compelling promise to society that we could fix book distribution, and society had extended me a line of credibility credit. Society had said, okay, we'll choose to believe you. You can borrow our trust. Here are prizes and acclaim. And when it didn't work out, that debt came due in embarrassment and a loss of confidence. And by the time I went to Mexico, I was burned out. I'd driven myself to exhaustion. I'd racked up too much debt against my own body. I'd borrowed too much from my own stores of confidence. I didn't have the strength to pretend anymore. I tried to push through that embarrassment and lack of confidence with hard work and late nights and constant worry. And I'd borrowed against my body and against my relationships, and I was in debt to them over my head. And that's okay now. I took those deals and they didn't work out. I was really lucky that even then I could borrow from other places to weather the storm. I borrowed from the bank for money and from my family and friends for support. And it reminds me how important it is right now that those who are hit hard by this pandemic can borrow in all kinds of ways to weather this storm. So the waiting places are where my debts rebalance. During those stopping times, those transit times in the waiting place, somehow those debts are slowly but steadily forgiven or forgotten, or find a new, more sustainable equilibrium. And eventually, we become free of the worst of them, and we find a balance again. And most importantly, I keep making stuff. I found that it's critical to keep writing, keep building, keep creating just for myself. The first time my business crashed, even earlier in 2011, I built half a dozen websites as money-making experiments in a kind of crazy weekly contest with my brother. And during the last months of Paperwhite, on the side, I was working on BookDash and writing software that would form the basis of the business I run today. But none of those felt very serious at the time. And they weren't solving my immediate problem of not having any money. They were purely self-indulgent creative projects. But they helped. They were my investment in myself. And over time, they planted seeds of confidence that would regrow over months and years. The very act of being creative is to renew your faith in yourself. Creativity is how we prove to ourselves that we can put more into the world than we borrow, that we are more than the accumulation of our debts. And that once those debts are clear and your luck is back, that you will be standing there a full person again with something to lend to others. And so in that wait time, a kind of clarity emerges eventually and brings my next destination into view. So I remind myself that a balanced life takes two things. I tell myself, don't get in over your head. Don't get in over your head into one form of debt or another. And secondly, always work on creative projects that are entirely and only yours. And this means that the balanced life I'm aiming for is not someone else's idea of a balanced life. There is no universal formula for a balanced life. We each get to decide what debts we're willing to incur for our balanced life. I know that I'm not going to stop being busy and overcommitted because I love being a busy creative person. And that means always being in debt to something and always making new things. And as long as I'm conscious of my debts and making things for myself, then when I get stuck, the waiting places make more sense. Or at least I know that they will make sense one day for a reason that I can make up afterwards. Thank you.